أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters and friends, and welcome to this Islam21c one-on-one big discussion. The topic and the situation of Syria is something both known to everyone to some extent, but understood by very few people in its full extent, including myself. And in the recent days and weeks, we've been seeing the name of the place, Idlib, more and more frequently in the news coverage, where you are, where I am. And I thought I'd like to really extend my gratitude and my salams to our special guest, dear brother Moazzam Begg from Cage, who has agreed to discuss this very sad but yet hopeful, inshallah, story of the Syrian revolution and the story of Idlib. What's happening next, what's happened in the recent history and so forth. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, brother Moazzam.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Just to bring us up to speed, first and foremost, what is your personal connection with the area, the province of Idlib?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. I was in Syria in 2012, 2013 for several months. I lived in the Idlib, Muhawadat Idlib as it's called, or the province of Idlib, in the countryside area. My wife was working in a hospital there, and I was working on some of the issues regarding trying to speak to rendition victims. So if people try to understand some of the backdrop, when I used to be held by the Americans in the Bagram detention facility, they said, if you don't cooperate with us, we'll send you to Egypt or to Syria. So there was this intelligence cooperation that was already going on with the Americans and the Syrian regime. And that's interesting because Bush at the time had called this the axis of evil. But when it came to Muslims and people deemed to be politically active from the Muslim community, they were working hand in glove with the Assad regime. They were sending over people to be tortured there. And the Syrian torture regime was quite famous or infamous in the Arab world. So that what initially took me there to Syria to follow up with some of those rendition victims, to meet with some of them. By that time, some of them had been part of the revolution and had bigger things on their mind.
Yeah. So were you there on Cage business, really? Yeah,
so I was looking essentially at, as I said, the renditions program. When I came across several of the rebels and several of the different groups and individuals, of course, they were least concerned about what I had come for and more concerned with surviving the attacks of the regime that had begun. So we saw some of the barrel bombs. We saw, I saw myself some of the effects of the targeting of people. Spoke to numerous victims who had been imprisoned, tortured, rape victims, and it was horrendous back then, even though it wasn't so intensive.
SubhanAllah. I mean, we have this, whatever we want to call it, conflict, civil war, crackdown on the people of Syria. This has been going on for 7 years now, so there's probably a whole generation of brothers and sisters who've come to awareness of what's happening around them in politics and so forth, who've grown up not knowing, the history, or, what actually has gone on in Syria. Could you just give us a brief kind of history of, how we got to where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things, of course, is that the Alawi community, as it were, which are about 10% of the Syrian population, have been in control since the time of Hafiz al-Assad, who was the father of Bashar al-Assad from the 60s onwards. And it's essentially been ruled by a dynasty, a family, with an iron fist. It's pretty, as I said, famous in the Arab world in terms of its torture, the abuses and so forth. It was a socialist Arab Ba'athist ideology that they follow, not the same as Saddam's, but one that believes in Arab nationalism. One of the things that happened in the 80s, and particularly 1982, there was an uprising by the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, that was brutally put down, as known as the Hama uprising or the Hama massacre. Estimates vary, but around 20,000 or so people were killed and imprisoned. the shocking story I learned when I was living in Idlib myself is I met this man called Abu Ahmed, who was an amazing character. He owned many olive tree orchards that are in that region, and he told me he was imprisoned in Tadmor prison, which is at the east towards the Iraqi border, and there he remained for 16 years. His eye was poked out, so he became blind in one eye, and he started teaching people Quranic studies, which he had excelled in. And there were that many people in the prisons that the prison guards would forget the numbers of who is assigned what number. And he said that when his number was called, because the people loved him, to be executed, somebody went in his place. And that happened on a couple of occasions, and that's how he managed to survive. And so he told me that when the revolution began now, he was proud that his sons, that his grandsons, he lived in a village where they're all an extended family, were now fighting against the regime, and he felt very confident now that this was the time to do that.
This is often portrayed through the language of the war on terror, especially by some hostile kind of Western media outlets, Russian obviously, and Iranian kind of rhetoric and broadcasting. But it's correct me if I'm wrong, this is just a continuation of the kind of fervor that was spread throughout the Arab Spring, right?
Yeah, so the use of the language of terrorism, of course, has now been adopted by everybody. Everybody's calling everybody else a terrorist. So the Turks, for example, regard the Kurds, who are the PYD and the YPG in the Syrian regime, in the Syrian area, they regard them as a terrorist entity, as they regard the PKK as a banned terrorist organization. So they are fighting them. Hezbollah, which is fighting on the side of the Assad regime, are a banned terrorist organization in the West. Jabhat al-Nusra, or its various incarnations as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, has been recently labeled a terrorist organization. And of course there's ISIS. So there are all sorts of players, and everybody's throwing the terrorism label in order to be able to conduct the types of things they wouldn't normally be able to do. So Russia uses the language of the war on terror just as much as America does, just as much as Britain does, just as much as China does on the Uyghurs or the Burmese, the Rohingya by the Burmese government. So it's now, it's meaningless. Literally calling somebody a terrorist is meaningless. It's just a carte blanche to be able to dehumanize your opponents.
What's the actual reality then on the ground? What were the people calling for?
The terminology of the people initially was, of course, when the Arab Spring followed from Bouazizi that happened in Tunisia, and that all continued right across North Africa until it reached Syria. And Syria was slightly different to the other places in that there were not necessarily any Western vested interest in Syria.
It's not oil?
Yeah, there's no oil. Then there are other resources, it's strategic and so forth, but there's no oil. And there are other players. But the people came out to the streets and said, Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam. That's what they wanted to bring down the regime. Initially, they weren't saying that. They said they just wanted islah, change, reform. And when protesters who came out and were shot, women were taken off, abused, raped, and bit by bit, the response to peaceful protest couldn't continue as peaceful protest with such brutality. And so people initially, who were part of the very army of Bashar al-Assad, formed the Free Syrian Army, and people like Colonel Riyad al-Assad and others were the founders and the heads of the Free Syrian Army, Jaysh al-Suri al-Hur. And it was only after that that other groups joined from various backgrounds, but that was the initial resistance.
It's important to reframe that because, I mean, sadly there are many people who, perhaps because of a genuine ignorance of the actual history of the revolution, perhaps because of whatever motive, they try and paint this as, it was just everyone was fine under Bashar al-Assad, and people just started to make khuruj against him for no reason or something like that. But it's very important to put these into perspective because people will pick and choose any hadith or ayah or a statement from a scholar in history to prove whatever political or desire that they have. But it seems that the people were just pushed to such a degree that they reach breaking point. So we can't really sit down and blame them from our comfortable armchairs of what the consequences of that, because they had nowhere to go. I mean, it's hard to put yourself in that position, where You know, they were systematically using torture, rape, crushing any even peaceful kind of call for their God-given rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them. There's only so much a people can take of that before there's some kind of reaction.
Yeah, I mean, there's propaganda and there's counter-propaganda, and of course the old saying is that the first casualty of war is the truth. But nonetheless, in today's age, you do get to see pretty much what's happening pretty quickly. One of the things that Sister Yvonne Ridley recently did, she went to Turkey and interviews a number of sisters who had survived mass rape. Now, rape used as a weapon of war has been documented for hundreds of years, and it was used recently, as recently as Bosnia when I went there. I remember the rape camps that existed when I was there in the 90s. It hasn't stopped. It's continually used. And what's the sad part of this is that literally it's been done by Syrians to Syrians. And in the name of breaking the resistance, breaking the revolution, breaking the rebellion, or as they want to call it. But that's just one tactic. There was the famous skinning alive of Hamza al-Khatib, a young boy, by the regime. People were buried alive. And I knew about these, I can't express to you the fear that I had when the Americans said to me, "We will send you to Syria." I was terrified of that. I was not terrified of Guantanamo. I said, "Send me there anytime."
This is before the
This was in
revolution.
2000, yeah, so it's in 2002. And I heard of the case and have since become known and met with several of those Syrians who were renditioned to the Assad regime. Maher Arar, Abdul al-Maliki, these two Canadian Syrians who were renditioned to Syria and remained in coffin-like cells, underground cells for 10, 11 months at a time, beaten by cables, electric cables, and electrocuted and so forth.
Without trial, without any...
Of course, the concept of justice didn't exist at all, and it doesn't. Since then, Amnesty International, the United Nations have produced report after report of the tens of thousands who've been killed, tortured, abused, starved inside the various prisons that exist within Syria.
See, most people don't really know that. I mean, even myself, I remember, those... when reading those hadith about, a man would be, in previous times, would be brought and, a hole would be dug for him, sawn in half, skinned alive, buried alive, just because of his, essentially his iman. Yeah. Right? I thought, wow, this must have been, some really strange time in the past that this could never happen now. But it was only after the videos itself from the the beginning of the Syrian revolution, that these videos came out. I remember seeing a man just being buried alive because he was saying La ilaha illallah, and the people were telling him to say the name of Bashar or bow to his picture or something like this. But even myself, I only came to know about this after the revolution had become. Was this kind of stuff happening before? This is
the people I've spoken to. So there are several things that happened. For example, in 2008 there was the infamous Sidnaya massacre, where several hundred prisoners were shot dead before they were tortured by the regime in the Sidnaya prison. Now, the types of torture, as I said, that was going on, at least in my knowledge, in my living memory, had begun from places like Farah, Palestine, the infamous Palestine branch prison where people were initially taken to in Damascus and tortured beyond recognition. So that was already happening. What the civil war or the revolution unleashed in the government was this retribution, whereby they don't even see these people as Syrians anymore. They started saying that these are foreigners, it's part of a foreign agenda, started putting in conspiracy theories that Israel's behind it, America's behind it, and they simply couldn't get the fact that actually what's behind it is decades of oppression. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, subhanAllah. So there's a very good question here, and that is, who are the actual different parties on the ground in Syria now? Because this can look like a really complicated web.
It's deeply complicated. At one point, just a few years ago, you could look online and find that there are literally 1,000 groups operating within Syria on both sides. But just to break it down, primarily you have the Assad regime, and the Assad regime itself is backed and supported by Hezbollah from Lebanon. The aerial support and logistical support comes from Russia, which intervened in 2015, which is at the point at which two things happened. One was the rise of ISIS and its declaration of caliphate the year before, which broke the back of the revolution and almost stabbed them in the back. And the other was the intervention of the regime. Now, there were points at which the rebels were poised to capture Damascus. and they had spread that far out.
The rebels, who are the rebels?
So the rebels are Syrians initially from various regions, like
People defected from the Syrian army.
Well, there were people like that, but there was Harakat al-Ahrar al-Sham al-Islami, there was Jabhat al-Nusra in the beginning, which was Al-Qaeda, there were various other groups, there's too many to name.
And many groups were just kind of local battalions formed from, you know, local communities, right?
Yeah, so that's why there's so many of them, because there was no central command structure. Even the Free Syrian Army was just a loose umbrella over numerous groups around the country. What they had done is tried to form various alliances. There was a Jabhat al-Islamiyya, the Islamic Front, which included so many other groups from the north and from the south, and various repeated attempts at unity, and that was one of the things that the rebels were not able to do. They weren't able to unify themselves in the way that was effective against the regime. On the other hand, despite that, as I said, they were poised to capture Damascus, the capital. And if that had fallen, then the entire map of that place would have changed. But with the intervention of the Russian aircraft, bombing literally every civilian, in the name of fighting ISIS, of course.
Conveniently.
Yeah, and just bear this in mind, it's really important that we understand this, that whoever has air power is able to carry out more destruction than those who are not, who don't. Britain, France, America, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Jordan, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates have all been at some point or another bombing inside Syria, and none of them have been bombing on the side of the rebels. It's always been against either ISIS or other groups like al-Nusra or the rebels. And so you can imagine the type of devastation that's been meted out against the rebels. Not to say that they haven't carried out atrocities, of course they have, but you can see whoever has more firepower can inflict more damage.
Yeah, subhanAllah. The recent news about Idlib, today, we'll get onto today, but why has Idlib in particular been in the news so much in the last few weeks?
So Idlib is regarded as the last stronghold. There are pockets of rebel groups still even in the Damascus region, not in the city, but in the region, in Hama also, in Homs. And so there are still pockets around in different areas. And ISIS still exists in some parts near Deir ez-Zor towards the east. But Idlib is a city, and it's also a province, the name of a province. In it are cities like Ma'rat Nauman, Jish al-Shughur and other places. And so there's people that have been internally displaced people have moved in as refugees from the various parts where they've been driven out by the Assad regime, like for example from Ghuta al-Sharqiyya recently, where the chemical attacks took place in Douma, and also from Aleppo. So now it's swelled this region.
So those were the previous kind of strongholds.
Yeah. So it's swelled with refugees. It's filled with internally displaced people. And so now they've got nowhere else to go because it's on the border with Turkey. Turkey has as a country has afforded so much to the Syrian refugees. There's 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and it's almost impossible for them to absorb anymore. That is as a percentage
of the population.
The entire population, I think, is about 22 million, as I remember. So there's now there's as I said, there's about
more than 10%.
There's about 3 million. The report says that there's about 3 million people in Idlib, of whom 1 million are regarded as children, young adults and children. So the prospects are very scary for them because they've already been moved from places of war, continuous war in some places. Imagine you were in a Damascus region, then you moved over to Hama, to Homs and so forth and sought refuge there, then you had to run away again and then run away again, and finally this is the last place you can run to.
So what has been happening when the Syrian regime has been taking over these cities?
So of course what you can expect, it's varied in different places. For example, in some places the rebels have laid down their arms and come to some sort of agreement. We don't know what's happened to them. In most cases they've been either imprisoned or tortured or killed. It's almost impossible to conceive that the regime now, which is regarded the type of language and war they wage against these rebels, who they see as foreign intruders, will afford them any of the treatments under the Geneva Conventions, for example. So they won't. And I think likewise, if the rebels also respond in kind, it's a very bitter, brutal war in which there is almost no quarter at all. Life goes on in the region where the government is in power. And of course, you couldn't tell there was a war in some parts where it's been untouched. But for the most part, a lot of Syria has been destroyed, especially the old parts of Aleppo, the old city. You know, in Homs, even where Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu was buried, that mosque itself, that place was hit and damaged by shells.
SubhanAllah. So that's the history of Idlib, and a brief history of Idlib until now. And today there have been some more, or yesterday there had been some more developments.
Yeah.
Right?
So there was this belief, and still it continues even now, that the Assad regime, along with the Russians and Hezbollah, would pulverize and decimate what was left of the rebellion here in this place. And again, it was the use of the language of terrorism to say that the Tahrir al-Sham that's in charge is a terrorist organization, therefore we can conduct this operation. The Turks have intervened, the Russians, and have spoken to the Russians, and on the table they've reached an agreement, which is essentially to place a corridor around Idlib, which is manned on one side by Turks and on the other side by Russians. And that is designed to protect what is the impending massacre of the people in that region. We don't know how long it will hold out, but the intention, I think, is good. I believe that the Turks, it wouldn't benefit them in any way to see a mass exodus of 3 million people more into their country. I don't think that they would be able to withstand it. At the same time, it's kind of an international and a localized response to the humanitarian catastrophe that will take place if this continues. The real fear is that if they continue to use the language of terrorism to regard those in charge of Idlib, then why wouldn't they attack them? The argument would be, how are you allowing a terrorist entity to exist and control that region that you say you're protecting?
And even, is this also some of the rhetoric coming from Western powers and Western media spheres? Because they don't like Bashar very much. I mean, despite working with him in the past, there seems to be this polarization now with...
So in terms of Western support for the rebels, it did exist. Up until about January 2014, Britain even was sending non-lethal aid to the rebels. So non-lethal aid meant things like maybe body armor, like generators, like anything that's not a weapon. But they stopped that because they said that the Free Syrian Army was working alongside radical Islamic groups. And so that stopped. There was intervention or support from places in the Gulf, but that's lasted for a very short amount of time. So essentially the rebels were left pretty much on their own, other than this sporadic corridor that was open between there and Turkey. So, you know, there was at one point the people used to come out, and even just recently they've come out again in mass demonstrations saying the same thing they used to say at the beginning, "Ash-shab yurid isqat an-nizam." We want to bring down the regime. And they also say, وَمَا لَنَا غَيْرَكَ يَا اللَّهِ. They keep saying this thing, we have no one but you, O Allah, to come up to our assistance.
In Idlib,
still in Idlib, yeah, still people coming out. I mean, there's a city of Adana. I used to go shopping when I was living there, and I'd expected that this place had enough. But it's not the case. Thousands had come out in the streets. Just recently you saw the demonstrations. One of the families that I lived with in Idlib, in one of the towns, are still, as much as they were back then, adamant that they will not surrender to the regime. And I think it's because there's a history. They know what to expect, and they don't expect any mercy at all.
It sounds like they... I mean, I've heard you talk about, you know, their mentality and their mindset. Before, it sounds like they would rather, you know, die on their feet than just be kind of killed on their knees.
I mean, just imagine if they surrender, what will be the retribution? What will happen to the prison? Now you have no way of defending yourself at all. You are completely at the hands of the regime, at their mercy. And if they decide to have no mercy, then you can watch.
Because the international community has shown that it's not going to...
do anything. I mean, they didn't. I mean, the shocking part of this is that, you know, I've always called it an international gang rape of the skies of Syria, where everybody has taken part. Not since World War II did Britain, Russia, France, and America bomb on the same side. So nobody has even attempted to put in a no-fly zone, which is what you would expect in a place that's getting bombed so badly. Nobody's had the...
Why do you think that is?
I think because nobody cares. They're too busy bombing It's like asking the rapist to give protection to the girl he's just raped. It's not possible. They've all got their hands or their planes deep red in the blood of Syrian people.
SubhanAllah. So, what's next for Idlib? What's next for the uprising, revolution, civil war, whatever we want to call it?
So it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure people already know that there are some English-speaking brothers from the UK who are still in Syria, and I'm sure that people have come across them. There's Bilal Abdul Karim of OGN News who reports regularly from inside Idlib. There's brother Toxis Sharif who works with his live updates from Syria, which I think you're going to be hearing from at some point.
Inshallah, we're trying to get a video message from him.
Yeah. So
we had some technical difficulties.
He's a wonderful brother that I've known very well. I met him out there, and he's remained there with his wife working on aid project after aid project tirelessly. And he's somebody that we as a community here should be proud of, that he's sacrificed so much. There's brother Dr. Shajul Islam, who works in the heart of the hospitals, and the things that he tells me, I speak to him quite regularly about what's happening. Sometimes it sounds very bleak, but again, his determination is just it's the type of determination that Muslims seem to have lost, and that is that I am here to help the people. I will be working regardless. I'm not going anywhere, despite whatever the threat is. He tells me how he works in hospitals that have been built into the mountains, into the rock, to avoid the heavy barrel bombs, and still through precision targeting by the Russians, they hit these hospitals. Often you'll see some of his reports when he
that can't be by accident.
Of course it's not. They're targeted, and of course the targeting of medical facilities in war is a recognized war crime. But again, where's the will? Where's the United Nations here looking at the actions of the Syrian regime and that of the Assad regime? So we'll have to wait and see. But it cannot be that 500,000 plus people have been killed and there's no accountability.
Do you? A lot of people they express hesitation when calling for the United Nations to step in and for some kind of intervention because of the disaster of the Iraq War and pretty much all of Western history. There's a tendency of going anywhere to help ends up doing more damage than before. Is military intervention something you recommend or you call for, or is this?
I can only go based upon things that I've seen before. Now there are United Nations operations all over the world, even as we speak. There are observers at least, and sometimes they do get attacked, and sometimes they have to weigh up whether this is something that they can risk for their national interest. But I remember in Bosnia, with the mass number of people who got killed, 50,000 women raped in rape camps. I used to see the Pakistanis there, the Bangladeshis there, the British there, the Malaysians there, the Turks there, armed to the teeth in their white vehicles. And yet all of these massacres happened. The greatest massacre of Muslims, I'd say of any group of people since World War II, was in Srebrenica. And that happened under the watch of the Dutch United Nations. So unless there's a real will for a country to do something, I don't think the United Nations is capable. That's why I think that this agreement reached with Turkey is a strong major power in the region, with Russia, is one that I trust more than what the United Nations would do.
It's something that we want to see Muslim kind of powers, Muslim states, Muslim majority countries stepping in whatever way they can. I mean, it's unrealistic. What some people think, that you can just wave a magic wand and send in a massive army and then just fix the problem overnight. But there must be something that Muslim states can do, or Muslims can do as citizens to lobby their governments to push for some kind of action. Is there like a clear plan that, or a unified strategy that people on the inside within Syria can say, this is what we want you to do, this is what we want you to call for? Because Syria is a stain on the whole kind of history of humanity. It's one of the biggest sustained attacks on a civilian population that we've seen in many years. So what can everyone cares about Syria, I would hope. In fact, some people they've just become desensitized to just seeing Syria. First it was Aleppo, then what was it?
Ghouta.
Ghouta, yes. Then it was Ghouta, save Ghouta hashtag, and alhamdulillah, a lot of money was raised, and we can talk about that. That's a very important thing. But is there like a, you know, an agreed upon or a good idea, strategy that's kind of approved of by the people themselves in Syria to say, look, we want X, Y, Z from the international community?
Well, of course, as I said, the strongest players in the region can bring about peace or at least defense of the civilian population. It's all about the will, the political will. Turkey has taken risk after risk after risk. They've put in their troops. Of course, Turkey has its own interest in fighting the Kurds that are based there, and they've got their operation called Operation Euphrates Shield, where they've placed Turkish checkpoints around areas around Idlib in order to protect the civilians there from Russian and regime weapons. So already this country is assisting. If you go into Turkey, you'll see the types of refugee camps that they have built. I've never seen anything like it. I've been in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and all these places. Never seen that type of facility and facilitation. So they've done
They're able to live.
They're able to live. They're in little villages, little towns built where they have all sort of sanitation facilities, running gas, running water, electricity, schools, and so forth. And it's a great gesture of brotherhood. I've just recently seen something like Pakistan has made, always talking about making a strong working relationship, a meaningful relationship with Turkey on separate issues. But it's a player, it's a regional player, it's a nuclear power. It could also be one of the nations which could help to secure the borders for Idlib and its protection.
So what can we do as citizens of these countries, either in the West or in the Muslim world, to lobby our government to say do X?
So many people in Britain, for example, of Pakistani origin, and Imran Khan has just come into power and is talking about all of the right things, removing corruption, helping the oppressed, etc., seeking justice. So this is one way we could lobby the Pakistani government in order to bring more assistance to the Turks, to work with the Turks, to even send Pakistani forces there as a type of local peacekeeping force. It's imperative that remains. There's also the aid effort, which, again, something deeply British Muslims should be deeply proud of. When I was in Syria, I used to see British ambulances, British fire trucks, British rubbish trucks, British doctors who were killed out there even working, nurses, aid vehicles and so forth. And there are numerous aid organizations still working there. I could name a few people who are interested, but I'm sure you must have come across Hand in Hand for Syria, that was changed its name recently to Hand in Hand for, I think, International Development. There's Ummah Welfare Trust, there's One Ummah, there's One Nation.
There's many,
there's many, and they are still, despite all of the difficulties of getting aid there, they are still working. In fact, they are the only ones working on the ground in relation to the bigger charities, let's say.
Yeah. So, number one, you said a few minutes ago, what we can do in terms of practical. We can lobby our governments, lobby different governments even to step up and maybe call for a no-fly zone. You mentioned that a few minutes ago.
Yeah. As I said, now that the Turks and the Russians have come to an agreement, I think that probably will hold. Unless then the only issue is that if both governments, Turks and Russians, have deemed some groups in Idlib as terrorist organizations, then I think what will happen next is that they will cause the rebels to fight one another. So if they have said that Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham is a terrorist organization which the Turks and the Russians regard as, then they will use other groups to fight against them. And then let's not forget that ISIS still exists. And they have been stabbing the revolutionaries in the back for quite some time, and they're still doing it. So I speak to some people out there, and they tell me that at some point we were getting more people killed by ISIS than we were from the revolution. So I think that they may just do that, leave it to destroy itself from inside, and that's one of the great fears of what may happen. And in that regard, I'm not even sure what the answer will be, because if they do joint operations, the very people that are supposed to be protecting you do joint operations against you, there's really little that anything will be done to support you. And I think then what will happen after that is that there will be some kind of a guerrilla war going on, and that'll
because they can't
just means more
completely
death.
wipe out
There's tens of thousands, there's hundreds of thousands of people. There are many fighters there and so forth, and who are armed. And I think to reach a point at which true peace is availed, there will have to be some recognition of the rights of the people there and the right to their struggle.
Yeah. SubhanAllah. So, number one, you mentioned calling for a no-fly zone, just to repeat. Number two, you mentioned, for example, petitioning Pakistani government.
Yeah, not just Pakistan. I mean, even here in the UK, the UK's policy on Syria has changed drastically. One of supporting the rebels now to criminalising anybody who wants to support them. So there needs to be a kind of resetting of that, which is a much harder task to do. But still, nonetheless, I mean, Britain does recognise that there is a humanitarian effort taking place there, and at least they could be lobbied to supporting that. I'm not for Western intervention at all in any of that region. I've seen what it does, but I do believe in localised support and defence.
Yeah. And then thirdly, you mentioned obviously the aid. What can we do in terms of sending aid? Obviously, apart from money, is the government the British government making it more and more difficult for people to send aid from here to Syria?
To my knowledge, I don't think so, because the organisations are still working with various local organisations that are based in Turkey, and the aid is being delivered via them. Of course, there are more laws and regulations in terms of the charities commissions and so forth, and to what's going to whom. But people shouldn't be afraid of that, of helping in the humanitarian effort. That is something that's noble, it's something that's recognised, it's something that's encouraged. We are encouraged as Muslims to do it. But of course, and there are multiple organisations out there, and the brothers there themselves, the organisations that I just mentioned, have mentioned those organisations themselves, so they do put a great deal of trust in them. They're on the ground and been working since the beginning. So you've spoken
to people inside Idlib, within Syria, who've actually received...
Yes, and regularly receive from... And again, if you want to know more, you can go to the Facebook page of Dr. Shajul Islam or Tox Sharif or Abdul Karim or many others. And if you're an Arab, a Syrian Arab, then you'll have access to far more. But these are for the English-speaking people.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Now, another piece of news came out this morning, and that is, I think yesterday actually, that is of something happening between Israel and Russia. I think it was the Israelis were doing some kind of operation within Syria, bombing campaign, and a Russian plane was shot down by a Russian surface-to-air missiles defense system operated by Syrians.
Yeah. So
what happened there?
Well, this is what happens when so many people are literally, as I said, violating the skies over Syria. That at some point something will happen. Remember, just a few years ago, actually the Turks shot down a Russian jet as well, and it didn't start local war. It was a mistake. I think they say it was a mistake, but these accidents do happen. The irony of this, of course, is that the very Russian-supplied anti-aircraft missile system by the Russians to the Syrian regime was used to hit the Russian aircraft, which they claim, they believe was Israeli. Now, what are the Israelis doing bombing in Syria? The truth is Israel has been making incursions into Syria since the Arab-Israeli war in the 60s. 67. In fact, they took the Golan Heights, and the Syrian government has done nothing to take it back. So now they say that part of the reason why Assad is on the right side of history, as it were, is because he's fighting the Zionist Israeli regime. The truth is, he's never fought them. He's never fought them to take it back. The Golan Heights is still in the hands of the Israelis. What the Israelis say is that they were bombing Hezbollah positions and factories that are in Syria, and that the Syrians claim that they were trying to defend themselves. But the truth, I think, is a little bit more murky.
I mean, the Russians aren't going to publicly say anything to the Syrians because, they're on the same side, as it were. They've come in to help them.
I mean, one of the things that I think we need to bear in mind, I've read a report recently that there were clashes that took place between Syrian Arab army forces, the regime forces, and the Russians. So these things do happen on the ground, that people, young, hot-blooded males, decide that their group is better than the other group, no matter who they are. And it does happen. It's happened even with allies. So I've heard that this happened, but I made a dua, actually. I said, Allahumma ahdrib al-dhalimeen bil-dhalimeen. May Allah hit the oppressors with the oppressors. وَأَخْرِجِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ مِنْ بَيْنِ أَيْدِهِمْ سَالِمِينَ, and let the Muslims come from in between them safe and sound.
Ameen, ameen. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, you mentioned that the Israelis have been coming in making incursions for many years, and the Syrians haven't done anything about that in the past. So it's a powerful point in terms of the propaganda that is given now, that they're saying, look, the Israelis are attacking us, so we must be doing something right, essentially, which is nonsense, right? But what is the likely position of the Syrian regime in terms of being able to sustain this any longer? Because it's been going on for many years now, and it was on the brink of collapse before the Russians stepped in, before Iran and Hezbollah stepped in. Now, Iran, the Russians, Hezbollah, they can't continue to do this indefinitely, can they? Could it be that their support is waning as well, slowly, or? Well,
they've always counted on the Assad regime. Always used the language of terrorists. He kept on saying that these are terrorists. I'm fighting terrorists. I'm fighting terrorists. When ISIS rose up, it almost proved him right. Other than that, the greatest people who suffered as a result of ISIS was the Syrian rebels themselves, and the largest number of people that were killed was by ISIS because of the takfir that they made of every group, including the Islamic ones, including the ones who said we want an Islamic solution at the end of this.
And many reports were saying that they were kind of given free rein.
There are. I mean, I think it would be too conspiratorial to say that the Assad regime didn't fight and bomb and kill and vice versa ISIS. But I think there were certain moves made that allowed ISIS to spread and break the back of the revolution, which was, as we both said, poised. They believed that they were poised to win, to take over Damascus. So I don't know whether Syria can sustain this. I mean, I think now they're in a stronger position. They've taken all these regions back, or the skeletons of these regions are now in their hands. But the truth is, the country's been drained. Of course it's going to be drained. And how long can Iran continue to support it with its own difficulties taking place? And Russia itself. So I think at some point they will have to pull back. And I think we may be now at that point where there's some kind of agreement. A powerful country like Turkey, if it's said it's placed its troops all around Idlib, that's it. I mean, and no one's going to, if you mess with Turkey, then you have to mess with, then you're taking on NATO. It's a NATO member, and I think nobody wants to do that.
So do you think now the time is right, the iron is hot for other Muslim countries to get on board?
I would hope so. I would hope, because Turkey at the moment is doing this by itself, and it has to be applauded for that. It has to be commended for that. Other countries should, and I said I felt that Pakistan is a player that can. It has military capabilities are very strong. It's a nuclear power. It has intervened, at least as part of United Nations forces, in many countries before in the past. I've seen them on the ground myself, and it could do this. It could support.
There's a lot of khair in the ummah,
there is,
even there's a lot of love for one another in terms of maybe not the heads of those states, but the ruling kind of families and dynasties, but the actual rank and file Muslim. Including
there is, absolutely there is, and I hope that they translate that into something practical, that's something that really helps and supports the people who are beleaguered. And one of the weapons that have been used against the people has been starvation. This is a weapon, a medieval weapon, that you literally surround a city, you besiege the place, you don't allow any supplies in, or don't let any people out, and as a result cut off the air supply literally. So that has been done, and again Turkey has been that lifeline, the sole lifeline.
I mean, the difficulty in the past for any sovereign nations to get involved is, we can't just get involved and transgress these boundaries around Syria.
Yeah.
But now, does that excuse still exist now because of, would you say this deal with Turkey and Russia has opened up the door for more people to come get involved?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I don't know who will. I don't know who in the local region has the desire, the capability, and all of those things to intervene. The local area. Jordan has taken on about 1 million or so, 1.5 million refugees. Lebanon has taken a similar amount. So they've all absorbed large numbers of refugees themselves. It's in their interest to keep the peace in that place also. So perhaps they might be able to send in peacekeeping troops to bolster the position of the Turks. I don't know if that's viable for them, but they could be involved in it as well.
Well, that's certainly been an interesting conversation for me. I hope our brothers and sisters at home likewise have learned a lot. Just to recap, because we don't want to be all doom and gloom. We want to give the viewers at home something practical and empowering that they can do.
Yeah.
Number one, first and foremost, obviously make dua, sincere dua for
I think
our brothers and
if I can
sisters.
just say that, just remember the Prophet ﷺ mentioned Ahl al-Sham. He's mentioned him in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this in Surah Al-Asr, Subhanalladhi asra bi'abdi laylan min al-masjid al-harami ila al-masjid al-aqsa alladhi barakna hawla. And when he said that they gave barakah to the place around Masjid al-Aqsa, this includes Ash-Sham. This is the place where Rasulullah ﷺ used to go as a young man towards this place for the business trips. It's the land of the prophets. It's the land when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ, He's talking about the land of Isa alayhi salam. This is the region he's talking about. It's still, you see the teen and the zaytun. And the Prophet ﷺ also said, إِذَا فَسَدَ أَهْلَ الشَّامِ فَلَا خَيْرَ فِيكُم, to the Sahaba. If the people of Sham are corrupted, there's no good left in you. So as long as the people of Sham are, inshallah, still protected, then there's good left for
They're
us.
like the thermometer of the ummah.
They really are, yes, exactly. Yeah.
So number one, first and foremost, we have to remember them and all other brothers and sisters suffering all around the world in our du'as, not in a disempowering way, but in an empowering way, because this is our number one weapon, right?
It is. Yeah.
Number two, aid, giving aid strategically to those working on the ground in particular. Number three, lobbying our governments, lobbying other countries, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of these, so many Muslim countries, mashallah. What can we do to lobby them? Number one, no-fly zone, trying to push for that.
And help to enforce and support the Turks' initiative of having a barrier
support
around
the Turkish initiative. This is a ray of hope, inshallah.
And indeed support those countries that have been taking in the refugees. So, as I said, those countries and those organizations that have been supporting and helping the refugees in Turkey primarily, Lebanon and Jordan, they of course also need support.
SubhanAllah, they've taken the brunt of...
They have. We complain here about taking a few hundred refugees and change our entire policy. We leave the European Union as a result of that. But there, you hardly hear a complaint in comparison. Look at the perspective.
This is no doubt down to something inside a person's heart and their iman. Well, I hope you had an interesting discussion as well. I hope the brothers and sisters watching at home, you learned as much as I did. We can carry on this conversation at Islam21c.com. Please continue to comment below and share this video with your family and friends, and don't forget to support the Syrian people in your du'as, in our sadaqah, and more importantly, not more importantly, but equally as importantly, trying to lobby governments, lobby people we know in different countries and so forth, to genuinely help this new ray of hope that we've seen, to bring about some kind of political, diplomatic, military support even. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive all of our shortcomings with regards to Syria and all of our shortcomings in general. And I'd like to thank our guest, Brother Moazzam Begg, for kindly joining us. And I'd like to thank our guests for watching. I've been your host, Dr. Salman Butt. And that's it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I begin this video message by first and foremostly saying Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. It is a big blessing to be here in the blessed land of Bilad al-Sham, and furthermore so here in Idlib, despite all of the trials and tribulations. And we ask every single one of you that are watching to please make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps us steadfast and allows us to keep serving and supporting the people here, inshallah ta'ala. Ameen. That being said though, it's very important for me to get across to you the current climate, the general atmosphere and the feelings here in Syria, in Idlib right now. Now, I would sum this up by using two words. One is uncertainty and the other is resolve. Now, let me explain that to you. Firstly, there's a feeling of uncertainty on the ground. The reason being that over the last 10 to 12 days, the Russian and the Syrian regime began a fierce bombing campaign to many of the towns and villages in the countryside of Hama and southern Aleppo. Now this caused a rise of a feeling in the hearts of the people that an upcoming onslaught for Idlib is coming. Okay? And that had that has weight behind it. Why? Because this is a tactic that has been seen previously, where places like Ghouta, which fell, were bombarded into submission. The same as Homs and the same as Dar'a, most recently in the south. So that's why the uncertainty is there. At the same time, there is a strong sense of resolve. Alhamdulillah. And this is because the people simply have nowhere to go. I want you to understand the dynamic here on the ground right now. This region of Idlib has people from Damascus, places like Madaya and Zabadani, where people were eating grass, where you saw those pictures of people eating cats because they were starving. Places like Homs, Dar'a in the south, all of these besieged regions. On top of that, these ex-ISIS strongholds that fell of the so-called Islamic State, places like Raqqa, Mosul. We have Iraqis here also. Then at the same time, we also have foreigners, Muhajirin, people from Turkestan, East China and Kazakhstan, people that came here to support the people. The majority of these people have nowhere to go. Their backs are up against the wall. And this is when, in the times of the most adversity, that people rise. And this is the feeling of resolve that is predominant right now. Groups that were normally hostile to each other are now willing to work together. There has been thousands of people come out in protest, 202 protests across different villages, towns and cities. This is something we haven't seen for a very long time. People from local councils, civilians, starting to dig trenches in their own villages and towns by themselves, saying that, you know what, this is a do or die attitude. We have to do this. Despite groups that we don't like, or despite people that we don't like, we are going to defend because we just don't have anywhere to go. So, alhamdulillah, this is something that's there at the moment. Now, of course, yesterday an announcement was made by Russia and Turkey that some sort of agreement has come into place where there will be a buffer zone. But it's very important to understand that people here are not buying it. Why? Because Russia previously made deals in Asitana. Ghouta was a de-escalation zone. Homs was a de-escalation zone. Dar'a was a de-escalation zone. But every single one of them was violated and bombed into submission. And they all subsequently fell. So, the people here, they are hopeful of Turkey. But at the same time, they are tying their camel, they are taking their asbab, and they are preparing their defenses. So this is the current situation on the ground right now. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, how can you help? What is our role in all of this? Now, of course, it's very important that we make dua. Dua is the weapon of the believer. It's very important that we give charity. Charity is important emergency aid that the people need. But listen to this from me, your brother, who's been working in Ighatha as an aid worker for the last 10 years. Okay? Charity is not the solution. We must act upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us. Preparation is a theme that is explained in many ayat in the Quran. And this is something very important. The first time I saw a dead child in front of me and I felt helpless, I said to myself, I made an oath to myself, you know what? How can I not allow this to happen in the future? Because today I can't prevent it. Today I can bring some aid. Today I can alleviate the suffering a little bit. But how can I stop this? And this is where we need to start thinking about long-term solutions. We need to build institutions. We need to educate our ummah. We need to have people that are scientists, people that can manufacture equipment. We need people that can economically support Muslim countries. We need people to go back to their home countries. I'm a Pakistani, and we have many Bengalis, and we have many people from India that are Muslims and Arab countries. We need to be going back to our Muslim countries and investing. Turkey right now is a good place to invest, open dawah projects and work. These are long-term solutions that we need to be thinking about. We need to be building a new generation that is going to carry this ummah, that is going to be a group of people that are not just people who talk, they are people that act. They feel for this ummah, not that they just feel for this ummah and they're reactionary, that every time they see pain and suffering on their TVs, they give a little bit of money. That's not the solution, my dear brothers and sisters. So this is my message. Let's think long term. Let's think about how in 10 years time, what can I do today that will make a benefit in 10 years time? I always remember a famous Greek proverb that goes along the lines of, wise men plant trees that they will never sit in the comfort of the shade of. And this is very important. We need to plant those trees, my dear brothers and sisters. The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith that even if the hour was to reside, even if the hour was to come, continue to plant that seed. So plant that seed, my dear brothers and sisters. That's my message for you all. Please forgive me if I've said anything to upset you. Please keep the people of Idlib in your du'as, and inshallah ta'ala, victory will come to the ummah because it is promised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
The world today is an interesting place. Political earthquakes seem to have become the norm, as are social and philosophical tremors.
Is love between.
The myths upon which the reigning political philosophies were built are beginning to unravel.
End of liberalism.
Global system breaking up.
Liberalism is failing the
Destruction of organized human life on Earth.
As a result, political orthodoxies are being broken and new ideas are gaining currency. But this also means populism is increasing.
Multiculturalism has failed.
This is why we need empowered Muslims to be in charge of our own narratives, our own stories, our own voices, to show the world what it is crying out for, in the face of a system which disempowers people and pushes them towards simplistic misunderstanding, polarization and disunity. We cannot roll back the influence the digital medium has on our species, and the artificial intelligence of the empires that help create this societal polarization appears to be beyond control now. There will always be those who profit from driving people into darkness, silencing or deforming the irresistible truth of Islam for their own gains. This is the problem Islam21c was made to address. It's a volatile time, and the world is in desperate need of confident, unapologetic Muslims to enlighten humanity once again with the light of prophetic guidance. The 21st century needs Islam, and Islam21c needs you. The reward for shaping our future can be yours. Be part of it.